Introduction to Kant's Transcendental Idealism. So, in this brief talk, I want to discuss the ideas of Immanuel Kant, in particular his doctrine of Transcendental Idealism, and what motivated Kant to come up with this elaborate and Baroque theory, what motivated it, which is famously known from Hume, and I'll get a little bit into that, and what are sort of the broad sketches of this theory. So Kant was famously awoken from his dogmatic slumber by Hume, who had cast certain skeptical doubts about our knowledge of the external world, but not simply the external world, so much as our ability to know things that are not just mere logic of necessity. So, to give an example, Hume had this theory that we get knowledge from the external world, and that knowledge consists of impressions that are then associated together in the mind, and then from there on we get ideas and concepts, and then we form propositions, general propositions, inductive generalizations, and then relations of ideas, which are rather logical relations between propositions, or rather propositions of form rather than of content. But all the matters of content come from the external world, so to speak, from the senses, from perception, and these do appear to unfold with regularity, and they're predictable, yet this regularity and predictability doesn't give us knowledge into any sort of necessity. And by necessity, we can mean that, if there is, an event like the glass falls and shatters, the sequence of perceptions that is present is predictable, but there is no necessary connection between the steps in that event that necessitate things to occur in the way they do. Or at least there's nothing about the impressions that are given to us that justify us in inferring any necessary connection. Now, this might sound a little abstract, but in a sense, these skeptical doubts cast doubts on wider theories about the physical world, especially at that time, was Newton's theory of motion and his theory of general gravitation, where he had united the realms, the celestial realm and the earthly realm, under a common set of rules or laws that govern all physical events. And in Hume's sense, these rules are not known with any necessity. And in comes Kant, and Kant wants to rescue necessity, and he wants to rescue knowledge. And in particular, I haven't said the word yet, the very thing that Hume is casting doubt on is causality. And causality is essentially the view that events proceed from causes to effects. And the orthodoxy prior to Hume and Kant had been, in a sense, the view that effects are necessitated by causes. So in a case, if you have an effect, like the glass shattered, there is a preceding event in time which caused it. And so if the cause is present, then the effect necessarily follows. It's not a contingent thing. It is a relation of necessitation. And necessitation means that it couldn't have been otherwise. It couldn't have been otherwise if the cause was present, then the effect must necessarily follow. For those of you who are familiar with logic, in logic, the hypothetical or the logical consequence, if-then statements, are called material conditional. And in logic, they're called the material conditional because the relationship between the antecedent and the consequent is not one of causality, but it's just simply one of truth values. So in logic, whatever the antecedent and the consequent can be any random events, and as long as the hypothetical has a certain set of truth values that it follows, namely that if the antecedent is true, then the consequent must also be true, then you can put there in any events. However, semantically, in everyday speech, we use the hypothetical not in that general sense. Rather, the antecedent is always in some sense causally connected to the consequent. Give you an example is the famous, if it rains, the ground is wet. Right? So not only is there a logical hypothetical, but we also have a sequence that makes sense, that is causally related. Either way, Hume had essentially cast doubts on the idea that causality follows with necessity. So he had attacked the necessity portion. And what Kant aims to rescue is this very necessity. And the way that he does it is peculiar. So to begin with, Kant is going to say that there is necessity, but the necessity is not in the objects themselves. It's not in the glass shattering, is not in me hitting the glass by mistake with my with my arm, with my elbow, and it falling onto the ground. But rather there is something inherent in human cognition that makes events conform to certain rules. So there are certain rules that the appearances or perceptual events obey that are not inherent to those objects themselves, but rather is something that the human subject, that the human cognition contributes. So far, so good. So there is going to be an inversion in Kant. It's not that, we have information coming in from the world, and then we, represent that information internally, and with more exposure, information, and experience coming from the senses, from empirical input, that we then scaffold these generalizations, like if it rains, the ground is wet. That's not the case for Kant. He's going to do an inversion. Rather, what is the case is that we contribute the form of the perception that makes the raw material the raw input coming from the world conform to a rule. And causality will be one such rule. But it's not clear how Kant scaffolds it all the way to causality, but causality is one of the things he's trying to vindicate. And for Kant, causality is going to be necessary. The word that he uses is apodictic. And apodictic just means universally valid and necessary. So you might have heard the phrase synthetic a priori. So in Kant's entire project, in a sense, is asking the question, how are synthetic a priori propositions possible? And a prominent example of an a priori synthetic proposition would be something like every cause has an event. Every cause has an event. It is a priori because it is known prior to experience. You do not have to confirm it with the test of further experience. Rather, you know it prior to experience. And it is synthetic because it is not known by definition alone. For Kant, analytic, the predicate analytic means a proposition that is known by the definition of the term, such as a triangle has, 3 sides or something like that. Maybe even that is a bad example. But a circle is round, something like that. So propositions that are known by pure definition. So every cause has an effect is not known by pure definition. So it's not analytic. It will turn out to be synthetic, and it's not known a posteriori. It's not known with experience, from experience, but it's known prior to experience. Now this seems kind of extraordinary, and Kant's entire critique of pure reason is essentially, in a way, vindicating this claim, vindicating the possibility of synthetic a priori propositions. Okay, so let's start then with the positive claims that Kant makes. So Kant will divide his critique of pure reason into 2 parts, rather, many parts, but two large parts. One is called the Transcendental Aesthetic, and the other is called the Transcendental Logic. These 2 broad buckets that Kant categorizes all knowledge or all experience. The Transcendental Aesthetic has to do with, simply put, perception. The Transcendental Logic, simply put, has to do with thoughts and ideas. That's a very sort of colloquial way of putting it. Kant's terminology is far more intricate, and we will get into that later. But so in the Transcendental Aesthetic, Kant makes the claim that all perception has a pure contribution, a non-empirical contribution that the human mind makes. And there are 2 pure forms that he calls forms of intuition, and these are space and time. So what does this really mean? So in the Transcendental Aesthetic, we're dealing with something Kant calls receptivity. And receptivity is the ability for the mind or the subject to receive information from the world. For example, you look out of your window, you see a car passing by, you're receiving that information. However, Kant says that for receptivity to be possible to begin with, there has to be a form of receptivity, a form of that perception, and that form is spatial and temporal. So, in a sense, space, to take space as the first example, is not something that's in the objects themselves, but it is a prior condition necessary for the objects that we then see to be presented in the way that they are. That is sort of in community with each other, and so on and so forth. So space is not something that the objects themselves have. It's something that the mind or the subject contributes. It's the same thing with time. Time is not something that's there in a material object or in a sensation. Rather, time is something that we ourselves, that the mind contributes. Kant calls space and time intuitions. And in fact, explicitly pure intuitions. Now, it's not entirely clear what is meant by intuition, and there's all kinds of scholarship and Kant interpreters that try to understand what is meant by intuition. But what's important to get take away from Kant's claim is that space and time they're not concepts. So they're non-conceptual. They are forms of perception. So all the perceptions that you have from visual, auditory, of the external world, but also inner interoception and proprioception, all of these are subject to some sort of formal condition, and that formal condition is space and time. Now, specifically, Kant is going to say that that space is the form of outer objects or outer sense. So your inner sensations and feelings, that's not where the form of space resides. Rather, it's outer sense. So it's mostly perception of objects. Whereas time is going to be the form of inner sense. It's the form of how your own subjectivity proceeds in time, right? Your sense of your sense of self, your inner sensations, all of these will be subject to, Kant says, either the idea of simultaneity, happening at the same time, or happening in sequence at different times. And he says that it wouldn't even be possible for you to conceive of simultaneity or difference in time or sequence without there being some sort of prior contribution that resides non-empirically, purely in cognition, before there is any data that comes in. So space and time are in pure intuitions. They're there already. And it's not that they're there already, but they are the things that make perception, receptivity possible. And this is a familiar theme. This is going to be a familiar theme with Kant's entire project of Transcendental Idealism, which is his doctrine of cognition, that his method for discovering these things that he's telling us is to ask what are the necessary conditions of the possibility of something. So in this case, Kant is asking the question, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of experience? So he has a very, very ambitious project. He's trying to explain how all the things that we experience, how is it possible? And his answer is that by asking the questions of conditions of possibility, we can deduce certain necessary conditions that have to be there for the very experiences that we have to be possible at all. And in Kant's vocabulary and terminology, these are called transcendental arguments. So his methodology is to give or offer rather transcendental arguments. So in transcendental aesthetic, he does give arguments, but he begins by asserting this. He asserts that space and time are forms of perception. They are the form. So they are non-empirical. Space and time are non-empirical. That's what you have to take away. And understanding Kant's conception of space and time is extremely important to understanding his entire project in the Transcendental Idealism, because spatiotemporality will permeate all of possible experience. So all possible experience will have conditions of space and time. So to give a simple illustration of why Kant, for example, thinks that space is not empirical, would be something like two sides of a triangle must be greater than the third side. Kant says that this is not something that we learn empirically. This is something that we can learn reflectively. We know reflectively to be necessary. Necessary, not contingent. It can turn out to be otherwise. It's necessary. But it's not a logical necessity. It's rather a necessity of a contribution that the mind makes, a contribution that the mind makes in the form of space, of an intuition. So if you think to yourself, when you imagine in your mind's eye a triangle, it would be impossible for you to conceive of it such that two sides are smaller in length than the third side. It is inconceivable. And so Kant here is not unmotivated. He is very strongly motivated to say that there is something that the mind contributes, and that there is this pure intuition, non-empirical, this sort of cast that then the raw data comes in and it is conformed to. Okay, so far so good. So the first bucket, like I said, the transcendental aesthetic has to do with perception, and Kant tells us that there are two forms of pure intuition. They're non-empirical, they're necessary conditions. The second part is the transcendental logic. Now, just to give you a sense of proportion, the first part, the transcendental aesthetic, is roughly about 100 pages, 100 and so pages, where Kant makes these very extravagant claims, and where, in parts you can see the motivation and why certain things that Kant observes are actually well motivated, and other parts leave you with many unanswered questions. The transcendental logic is about 900 pages. Okay, so we said that space and time are non-discursive. Well, transcendental logic has to do with discursive knowledge. Knowledge that, in the traditional sense, in the Western tradition, when we think of knowledge, we think of knowledge that. And knowledge that is propositional knowledge. I know that Paris is the capital of France. I know that, matter is made out of atoms. I know that atoms decompose into electrons, protons, and neutrons, have a nucleus, electrons orbit the nucleus, and so on and so forth. This is discursive knowledge. This is knowledge that employs concepts, and these concepts are arranged in propositions that have a subject-predicate structure. And so this type of knowledge is what concerns the transcendental logic. Now, we should say that in the transcendental aesthetic, you do not have any of this yet. So we said that space and time are pure intuitions. Right, so they're not discursive, they're non-conceptual. Space and time are non-concepts. Kant repeats this over and over again in the transcendental aesthetic. They're not concepts. They are forms of the possibility of something appearing at all. And you can ask questions about, well, what exactly is that? And that's a topic for another discussion. So then in the transcendental logic, Kant is going to scaffold experiential knowledge from pure intuition and sensible intuition. Sensible intuition is going to be sensation. So when you marry the pure intuition with information, perceptions coming in, well, there you have this alloyed product, which is the actual perceptions of the world. Perceptions of our inner state, perceptions of what's happening outside. So we'll call that sensible intuition. You have pure intuition, and then you have sensible intuition. In the transcendental logic, Kant is going to tell us how we can get discursive knowledge that. And in the transcendental logic, he is going to do this by telling us that just as in perception, in receptivity, there is a pure component, which was space and time, in thought, there's also a pure component. There's also a pure component. And Kant is going to call this spontaneity. So is going to contrast receptivity with spontaneity. So our thought is going to have the characteristic of spontaneity. It's going to spontaneously sort of occur. And where was I going with it? Is going to be called spontaneity. And the faculty that will give us discursive knowledge will be called the understanding. The understanding. All right, so we have intuition, and then we have the understanding. Now, the understanding also has, like I said, a pure component. It's going to have a pure component. And by pure component, Kant means it's non-empirical. It has no empirical content whatsoever. It's something that resides in the mind already. It's a formal condition. And the formal condition, in this case, again, it's going to be a formal condition of the possibility of something. And in this case, it's going to be the formal condition of the possibility of experience and discursive knowledge. Now, you might think, oh, there's a little bit of a tension there. It's going to be a formal condition of the possibility of experience as such, which is, has sensations and, spatiotemporal objects, but also discursive knowledge. Yes, and we'll see later how all this comes together into something that Kant calls the Transcendental Unity of Apperception. How, for there to be any experience at all, the experience must be unified in a subject, the I think. But that's getting really ahead of us. So like I said, in the Transcendental Logic, there's going to be a pure component, and the pure component in the Transcendental Logic will be Kant's famous categories, the categories. And these are a distilled set of categories that Kant takes from Aristotle's categories, which I believe are 9 or 10, could be wrong, or 11. That Kant takes from Aristotle's categories and distills them into 4 that he thinks are pure, right? They're not found in experience, and they're necessary. And what's going to happen is that these categories are going to allow us to create propositions that are known a priori and that are synthetic. And these propositions will be the rules that all experience follows as its condition. So we haven't gotten to the rules yet. We've said that there is pure space and pure time, and that there are these pure categories, which I'll name in a second, but they're going to come together in a marriage that's going to give us synthetic a priori knowledge, such as the proposition that every cause has an effect. So Kant's categories are, and I will not get into much detail here, are quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So quantity has 3 types: universal, particular, and singular. Quality has affirmative, negative, and infinite. Relation has categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. And modality has... I am reading the Table of Judgments. This is wrong. And modality has problematic, assertoric, apodictic. So instead of reading the categories, I read the Table of Judgments, and I should clarify what the difference between the categories and the Table of Judgment is, which I'll do in a second. So essentially, the categories are this: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. So quantity is all or some, or this singular thing. Quality is it are you asserting something, affirming, or are you negating something? Relation has to do with causality. How do things relate to one another? Is it dependence, which is cause and effect, or is it inherence? And so on and so forth. And modality has to do with possibility, impossibility, and necessity. Right? Certain things will be necessary, like we already said. Certain statements, certain propositions will be necessary. Others will be merely contingent. Right? They will be possible, but they don't have to turn out that way. They could be, true or false, as we say in more modern logic. And then existence and non-existence, right? Whether something exists or it doesn't exist. And as someone who's read the entire Critique of Pure Reason knows, existence is not something that can be known a priori for Kant. You cannot reason your way into knowing whether something exists or doesn't exist through a priori propositions, through synthetic a priori. Synthetic a priori do not affirm or disconfirm the existence of anything. But that's really getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, so those are the categories. How these categories coincide exactly with the table of judgments, which are the form of judgments. What are judgments? It's synonymous. I'm going to use it. It's synonymous with propositions, right? So all propositions will have these properties, all possible propositions. But let's leave that aside for now. What I really want to say is that Kant's categories are going to come together with the constraints, the spatio-temporal constraints that he's already given to possible experience, to yield a set of principles that are true a priori and yet are synthetic. And these principles will be apodictic, which means they will be necessary, and they will underlie all of experience. And they are in the section in the Transcendental Logic called the system of principles. These can also be called constitutive principles. They're constitutive principles because they underlie all possible experience. So, without getting into too much detail, because this is meant to be a very broad strokes introduction, since causality will be one of these principles, what Kant essentially will be saying is that we know the necessity of cause and effect, not from experience, but from these pure contributions that the mind makes that are the conditions of experience, of possible experience. Okay, the conditions of possible experience. And in a nutshell, that's Transcendental Idealism. Transcendental Idealism is Kant being able to isolate the pure components in these two broad buckets, perception and thought. I've called them perception and thought. Kant will call them receptivity and spontaneity, or intuition and understanding as the faculties. Taking these two and isolating something that is the condition of possible experience and then bringing them together to yield a set of necessary principles that underlie all possible experience. So for Kant, it wouldn't be possible for you to even have experience unless there were an underlying rule connecting perceptions together by some necessity. And the necessity will be the necessity of form. This is very important if you want to understand Kant, to understand what I mean by necessity. So it's not necessary that the glass shatters. Rather, it's necessary that the cause precede the effect, and that the effect follow the cause. So that formal component, that's necessary. The shattering of the glass itself, the empirical event, is contingent. The underlying order of it, that's the necessary part. This makes some very strange consequences, as we will see, because it will turn out that mathematics, which contentiously, it's not clear in Kant, might reduce to analytical geometry, is all synthetic a priori, but also, in a sense, the necessity of the laws of physics. The laws of physics are themselves contingent, but they are predicated on an a priori necessity, right? The necessity of cause and effect. Without the necessity of cause and effect, you wouldn't even be able to discover these universal rules of gravitation and the rules of motion, the laws of gravitation and motion. You wouldn't even be able to discover them unless, says Kant, there is some necessary connection that's there as a condition of possibility of inexperience at all. Okay, so far so good. And so this is his Transcendental Idealism. The interesting thing Kant will do is that he will limit his Transcendental Idealism to possible experience. So what Kant will say is that the understanding, or the thought component of cognition, has a tendency to unmoor itself from its domain of validity. And its domain of validity is conditions of possible experience, and conditions of all possible experience, like we said, are constrained spatio-temporally, right? So the application of the categories in the system of principles that are all synthetic a priori only apply to possible spatiotemporal events. Now, Kant says and recognizes that sometimes reason, the understanding, and I'm conflating reason and the understanding in Kant. Reason is when the understanding goes a little astray, is when reason, right, our thought component, or our thought tendencies, tend to overflow these constraints, these spatiotemporal constraints, tend to overflow possible experience and try to ascertain knowledge that is not permitted by Transcendental Idealism. Again, Transcendental Idealism is the constraining of the understanding of all knowledge to possible experience, and all possible experience must be spatiotemporal, must have a spatiotemporal domain of validity. And then, like we said, space and time are not out there in the world. They're something that we contribute. And so, for example, to basically wrap this up, the Transcendental Logic, which has to do with discursive knowledge, is divided into two main parts, the Transcendental Analytic and the Transcendental Dialectic. So the Transcendental Analytic gives us the constitutive rules, Transcendental Idealism. The Transcendental Dialectic will give us reasons overflow out of these constitutive rules and try to ascertain knowledge that is not justified by the Transcendental Idealism, by the constraints of Transcendental Idealism. What will these be? These will be things like God, immortality, and the soul. So, ascertaining the existence of God by reason, by giving rational arguments, that's a no-go zone for Kant. Why is it a no-go zone? It's a no-go zone because it overflows the constraints of possible experience. Now, there's a lot of minutia here that I'm not getting into that make this far more sort of credible and interesting. But as you can see, Kant is trying to rein reason in, trying to rein it in to a domain of validity, a domain of applicability that has to do with what he calls possible experience. And all possible experience is constrained spatiotemporally. So God will be one of those things, but not just God. The beginning and the end of the universe. This is not something that possible experience can ever conclusively adjudicate for us. Possible experience is never going to tell us whether time is finite or infinite, or whether things have infinite decompositionality, or that they that there is a limit. For example, as we know from quantum mechanics, you can come down to some sort of quantum fluctuation, quarks and leptons and things, and constituent particles. We can't know from possible experiences, Kant. We can't adjudicate whether there is a limit to how far we can break things down, right? Or whether they're infinitely decomposable, and so on and so forth. This is the section of the antinomies, the antinomy of pure reason. And the other thing that Kant says is a no-go zone as well is knowledge of the soul. And this is a far more complicated subject, but the soul has to do with the self, and to Kant, the self, like all possible experience, is an appearance. An appearance that itself has to obey the conditions of its own possibility. And those are the very conditions that we sort of sketched out very cursorily so far. So I didn't say a lot about appearance, but one of the consequences of Transcendental Idealism is that all that we experience are appearances. Why are they all appearances? Well, because we don't know what things are like in lack of the pure contributions that the mind makes as the conditions of the possibility of that very experience. Okay, so I don't know what objects are like, right, outside of experience, and that's because the human subject brings certain formal constraints that make objects appear as they do, and so objects are not sort of self-subsistent things that are mind independent, but rather they are, so to speak, as they appear to us, they are mind dependent. And they're mind dependent only insofar as that pure contribution that the mind makes, in the sense that every object must conform to spatiotemporal constraints. And then our discursive knowledge must also follow in line with conforming to all possible spatiotemporal constraints. So if I have a proposition that I want to justify, that I want to give reasons for, that goes beyond what possible experience can sort of sanction, then that would be reason gone astray for Kant. That would be sort of philosophy trying to justify metaphysical claims that are not justifiable. And that's what the Transcendental Dialectic deals with. So, in a nutshell, that is Kant's project. And there are many sort of detours that we can take and clarifications and delving into more deeply into the subject matter of Kant's critique of pure reason, as it is a very detailed and Baroque work that is extremely intellectually stimulating, and in Kant is unclear in parts, but he strives for clarity, and he has erected here an edifice that there is nothing like of its kind, I would say, and that is extremely intellectually rewarding for anyone to engage with, as this is a very ambitious project. It's an extremely ambitious project, what Kant is after, and he will try to explain pretty much everything as you go through the landscape of his text, as he at one point calls it. So I hope that this short but not so short explication has been useful, and if there are if it's rough around certain edges, I apologize for that. Anyone who delves deeply into it knows that once you get into interpreting the text, there are many intricacies that cannot be obvious from such a cursory and broad sketches painting of the picture. Thank you. I will follow this discussion with some more nuanced discussions that delve deeper into the critique of pure reason and Kant's more general project. I've said nothing about freedom, about instrumental reason, but I also want to delve into discussion of phenomena and noumena, which was not very pronounced in this one, and the controversies that surround that distinction in Kant, the complications that arise from Kant's distinction between general logic, which I hinted at but didn't really explain, and transcendental logic, and there's still ongoing interpretation about how to take that. Kant's schematism, or schemas, is another controversial topic in Kant. His view of the imagination, which is not imagination in the colloquial sense, but it's a formal sort of faculty that Kant here, at one point he will elevate, and at another point he will demote, and it stands between intuition and the understanding. So his view of the imagination and Kant's account of the self, which is one of his most interesting contributions in my view, his Doctrine of Transcendental Unity of Apperception, which I think is still relevant today in the search for artificial general intelligence. And despite Kant being, you could say, explicitly wrong about certain things, the general claims that he makes and the general thrust of his project is correct and is vindicated in broad strokes by cognitive science, but the specificity of his claims are not vindicated, I would have to say. But yeah, a discussion of Kant's account of the self is very interesting, and I would say still relevant today in our attempts to understand the architecture of the mind and how that mind resides in a physical locale, the brain, which has a network architecture.